The first couple of authors here. Best-selling books by Richard Dawkins. He's the author of The God Delusion. You see him, if you watch YouTube at all, you'll see Richard Dawkins a lot. Well, I guess I might have weird YouTube preferences, but he's served to me a lot. Let's put it that way. Let's see. Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, they assume that science in general, and evolutionary science in particular, has made belief in God unnecessary and obsolete. Dawkins said very famously that although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Okay, see what he means by that? Before Darwin came along with his Origin of Species, they weren't able to correctly account for how this world could have come to be, but now that Darwin came and showed that every species has a common ancestor, well then now they can be intellectually satisfied with saying there's no such thing as a creator, okay? In The God Delusion, he goes much further. He argues that you cannot be an intelligent scientific thinker and still hold religious beliefs. It's one or the other. To support his thesis, he points out that a study in 1998 showed that only about 7% of American scientists in the National Academy of Sciences believe in a personal God, period, not question mark. This is proof that the more intelligent, rational, and scientifically minded you are, the less you will be able to believe in God. All right, so take a second with the people around you. What do you think is driving these comments? Have you had similar thoughts? Must we choose between thinking scientific? Is it up or down are you doing with it?
A little up, it's a little behind in the back.
Okay, then we need to move the speaker forward or it'll feedback a little bit.
Okay.
Or I need to move that. Yeah, that's loud now, isn't it? We'll get it. See that? Is that going to feedback? That sounds better, huh?
I think that sounds good.
Okay, great. So, as I was saying, talk amongst yourselves just a little bit about do we have to choose between thinking scientifically and belief in God? Ready, set, go.
To be honest, I was analyzing
Well, see, in order to believe evolution, you have to believe in evolution. You have to believe in
yeah, because like the main problem with evolution is literally everything that's
and again, science.
everything you know about biology is
A minute or so to finish up your thoughts.
basically all of the notes that Darwin put forward, like species, they've only gotten for organic evolution and for it's a like evolution.
So it's kind of interesting that scientists too can use data to say what they want to say. Mark Twain used to say there's lies, damned lies, and statistics. This would be an interesting example. So he said, Dawkins says only 7% of the National Association or National Academy of Sciences believe in a personal God. It is interesting when you ask what was the question that was asked. And the question that was asked was, so you could say, you would have been included in the 93% of those who say they didn't believe in God if you personally believed that there was a transcendent God who created the entire universe by the word of his mouth. In this question, you would have still said no, because it included a point of who continues to speak to man. So this is kind of an interesting twist that he puts on it. In fact, I think Alistair McGrath talked about that very thing, and he said he takes issue with the fact that Dawkins' assumption that the scientists disbelieve because they're scientifically minded. That's a big leap. What McAllister says is that he writes that many of the unbelieving scientists that he knows are atheists on grounds that aren't science. Right? They're not atheists because of their scientific view, but some are personal experiences, some intellectual, some social. So it's just interesting that you can make things say whatever you want to say with statistics, and I think Dawkins certainly does that there. What we're going to do today is we're going to recognize the fact that we don't have to be, there doesn't have to be a mutually exclusive choice of faith or science. That's not the case. The difference is this, is that when it comes to reason, which is where science falls inside of the area of reason in the human makeup, and in the area of faith, well, one needs to be in charge and one needs to be a helper. Martin Luther always used to talk about reason being the handmaiden of faith, so, but not its queen. In the same way, so science is an absolutely fascinating way for us to look and see the face of God in the creation of this world and in the world in which we live. I'm fascinated by it. But it all comes down to what is, I really think it comes down to what is someone's worldview. And we're going to take a look at that. Start at the top of the next page. Are miracles scientifically impossible? The first reason many people think science has disproved traditional religion is that most of the major faiths believe in miracles, the intervention of God into the natural order. The miraculous is particularly important for the Christian belief. Christians annually celebrate the miracle of the incarnation, the birth of Jesus, each Christmas, the miracle of the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead each Easter. The New Testament is filled with accounts of miracles that Jesus performed during the course of his ministry. Scientific mistrust of the Bible began with the Enlightenment belief that miracles cannot be reconciled to a modern, rational view of the world. Armed with this presupposition, scholars turned to the Bible and said, the biblical accounts can't be reliable because they contain descriptions of miracles. The premise behind such a claim is, science has proven there's no such thing as miracles. Two things to think about here. What's the leap of faith regarding science that's embedded in that argument? Well, you think about that, the concept of the Enlightenment starting to deny miracles of the Bible, that's one of the reasons why we have that kind of a famous book called the Jefferson Bible. You ever heard of that? Thomas Jefferson just cut out of the Bible all the parts he didn't agree with, and he published it that way. And what he cut out were all the miracles, right? So that was the Jefferson Bible. Very indicative of what was going on in the Enlightenment during this time, moving from the Middle Ages into the Enlightenment, as they call it. People began to say, well, the science has proven that there's no such thing as miracles, but that's got an embedded premise in it. What do you think about it?
Well, actually, the argument's actually reversed. The fact that the Gospels record ordinary history and miracles together is evidence that those miracles happened because they thought nothing of it, including it with what happened otherwise.
Okay, excellent. So Bob said the fact that in the Gospels historical events and miracles were recorded together shows the fact that they considered them, I'm missing a little bit of the second half, that they considered them then to be both historical. Is that the way you were saying it? Yes, thank you. Yeah. What do you think, Dan?
That last statement, the science has proven there's no such thing as miracles. Science can't prove that there's miracles.
Yes, exactly. Why, Dan?
Science only deals with the natural world. They have no way to test the supernatural world.
That's such a great answer. Dan said science can't make that last statement because science tests the observable world. So the scientific theory is you have to have something that is disprovable, right? That's what science does, right? Robert, then Jimmy Grace.
Well, science actually kind of seems more to prove things that are statistically probable and statistically improbable. A couple years ago, there was a gentleman who was on a fishing boat. The fishing boat sunk. He was trapped in the galley for many days underwater in the dark. When the salvage team went to go get the boat, one of the salvage divers was in a room in the dark, and suddenly felt a man's hand reach out and grab him. And the man survived.
That wouldn't work.
Mercer's out, he's not himself.
And scientifically speaking, that is a miracle, because statistically, that can't happen. And yet, there's a man alive that says it did.
Excellent.
That's what miracles are, is extremely unlikely, improbable events that are beyond human understanding.
Jamie Grace?
Well, I was gonna make that point, that miracles still do happen, we just don't necessarily see them that way, because science tries to explain them away. Well, this person has a sudden weird growth that we think might be cancer, but we go in and test it, and it turns out it's completely benign, or goes away entirely. We don't have an explanation for that, so let's just shove it under the rug and say you had like extra hormones or something.
Okay, so sometimes maybe there's miracles still happening, we don't necessarily see them. Jim?
So, all knowledge is given a gift from God. And there's a point in time in human existence when a nuclear bomb would seem like a miracle. So, to look at what happens and think that it's supernatural is, it's all possible with God, right? But we just don't have that knowledge yet.
Okay, and this, you guys are bringing up really good and interesting points about, what is that great quotation that any sophisticately advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic for people. But something we want to think about here is that when we talk about miracles in the Bible, we're going to talk about miracles that can't be mistaken for a natural occurrence that happens on the outlying edges of the bell curve. So for example, in fact, Jesus wanted to make sure of that. Like when he decided that he was going to show his disciples that the whole world was in his control, even though John the Baptist had just gotten his head cut off, you know what, you guys, I'm in control, it's going to be fine. He decided to show them that he could feed as many people as he wanted to with a little boy's lunch. He didn't feed 35 people. He fed 5,000 men. Yeah, and then even more so, the disciples went and picked up the leftovers, and they each left with a basket full of leftovers. Right? It's absolutely impossible to believe that Jesus just managed to make, like my mom used to make beef stroganoff stretch. We had a lot more pasta. We had to go searching for the beef, right? Or the fact that see, the miracles in the New Testament are never, we're going to have a quote on this in the last page, are never meant to be like a magic show. They are only meant to show that Jesus was who he said he was, the Son of God, and that the Messianic age that had just dawned would end up being the restoration to the world to the perfection with which God made it. So every one of Jesus' miracles was about restoring creation and mankind in it. And in the Gospel of John, there are how many miracles recorded? You guys remember? If you're going to guess for a number in the Bible, you probably guess
17.
7. Yeah, 7 is a big biblical number. There are 7. The last great miracle recorded in the Gospel, according to St. John, Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Think about how they made sure that this couldn't be seen as an outlier. He was dead and buried, and he'd begun to decompose. I mean, you want to find a way to make sure a miracle's not like, today maybe he was in a coma in a vegetative state, and lightning struck the rock, restarted his heart. Not when you've begun to decay. Yeah, so it's interesting that, I want to go back a little bit to what Dan said, and this is important if you talk about faith and science. You cannot say that science has proven that there's no such thing as miracles, because that's not something science can do. Science cannot prove that. It cannot prove that miracles do not exist. It can look at something and provide a natural rationale or explanation as to how it could have occurred, but it can't prove the negative, that something could not occur in an unscientific way. Yeah.
Isn't that what makes them miracles?
Well, of course, that is what makes them miracles. And for science to try to say this, I love Alvin Plantinga in the little call-out box there. So it was, and I don't know how to say this guy's name, and I'm not good at French. Is it Macquarie? Macquarie is the one who said science has proven that there's no such thing as miracles. And he says, perhaps he means to suggest that the very practice of science requires that one reject the idea of God raising someone from the dead. This argument is like the drunk who insisted on looking for his lost car keys only under the streetlights on the grounds that the light was better there. Right? In fact, it would go the drunk one better. It would insist that because the keys would be hard to find in the dark, they must be under the light. Yeah, so kind of keep that in mind when we're talking about what people want to talk about, the place of science and faith. Bob?
Two things. First of all major branches of sciences were started by Christians.
Of course, yes.
Because they were said, if it's true, it points to God. And the second thing is, Dawkins is very selective when he talks about Darwin. Because Darwin said before he died, if the Cambrian explosion is true, his theory would not hold. And in the Cambrian explosion, and instead of seeing what Darwin said, we'd have one life form splitting to other life forms, virtually every major file that came into existence at the same time. And since his death, the Cambrian explosion has been overwhelmingly proven throughout the world that all major life forms came in existence almost simultaneously.
Yeah, which really doesn't work, right? Yeah, the Cambrian explosion is a really hard thing to explain. It's kind of like how obviously we're going to talk today about how God created the earth, but when we talk about the current model in the evolutionary mindset, of course the universe came as a result of Big Bang, right? There was a point of singularity, an infinitely dense, infinitely energetic, infinitely massive point that contained all the mass of the universe, and it exploded. And out of that explosion, quick cosmic inflation to get past the whole speed of light problem, and then everything was created from that. It was interesting though that recently I've been hearing people talk about wanting to move away from expressions regarding the Big Bang because, you know why they're saying we should move away from the Big Bang?
It's too Catholic.
Well, if you have this point of singularity, then the next question is, where did it come from?
Yeah, so what they'll just say is, they'll say, where did the point of singularity come from? That's a philosophical question, not a scientific question. I say, well, bunk. I mean, it's kind of like, God telling them, get your own dirt, and then you can start making stuff. But it's interesting that the scientific community has wanted to move away from that description of Big Bang because it sounds too close to Genesis. The idea that the universe had a beginning. Yeah.
But logically, if there was ever a time when there was absolutely nothing, then there would still be absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and the current answer among scientific thinkers, so if you talk about like the absolute impracticalities of life forming or this universe happening in exactly this way, like you take a look at, you could talk all day long about if the Earth were a few degrees off its axis or a few miles closer or further from the sun, none of this works. If one or two constants in the universe were off by a fraction of a fraction, the whole universe would fall apart. But to deal with the absolute incomprehensibly large statistically improbability of this happening, the current model is to say, well, absolutely, but there must be infinite universes. And we just happen to be the universe out of all the infinite universes where it actually worked. That's what's called a multiverse, if you're reading about that today. Bob?
But then you have to ask the question, where did those universes come from?
Philosophical question, Bob.
Well, no, what they're relying on is the law of causality.
Yeah.
And they misstate it. They say that every cause, or everything has a cause. But that's not true. The law of causality says every effect has a cause. So therefore, philosophically and logically, you can postulate an uncaused first cause.
First cause, yes. So the arguments for the existence of God go back as long as there have been scientific thinkers, right? And that's one of them. That's a really good one too. I think the other premise that's hidden here, number 5, what premises they're hidden about God, to say that science has proven that there's no such things as miracles, you also have a premise that says there's no possibility that a God exists who could do miracles. How can you prove that? That's absolutely non-provable. Jamie Grace.
Well, and I think the reason why scientists today are trying to get away from the Big Bang is one of the very basic premises of science says you cannot create energy from nothing. That's why we don't have perpetual motion. There's no such thing as energy that comes from nothing. It just can't happen. So the very basic premise of science that you learn in elementary school disproves the Big Bang. It's just, you can't have a point of singularity of energy that can
Yeah, you know, one of the things that, for everybody who's come through Faith Builders has heard me talk about creation and evolution. One of the things that I learned over the years that I've always run away from is you won't hear me talk a lot about the science behind creation or evolution. You know, I think I was trained, I think you weren't saying this, Jamie, but I remember going through school and being taught about the second law of thermodynamics, you know, entropy and enthalpy. And I still remember in my early years as a pastor talking about that when I talked about creation versus evolution. And then I had a guy that taught at one of our schools. He's Professor Spanholz. He's got a mountain named for him in Antarctica, of all things. I remember him him teaching us one time at a pastor's conference, and he had a hot cup of coffee in front of me. He said, just look at the surface of it. And if you look at the surface of a hot cup of coffee and look at the film, you know what you'll see? You'll see things start swirling around, right? Like a little hurricane sort of thing. You know what that's doing? That's going from a state of disorder to order in an area of low energy to higher energy, right? So that his point was for pastors is you don't know what you're talking about. So don't talk about science so much. Instead, maybe what you should talk about is talk about what the Bible says. And so whenever I talk about creation or evolution, and for those of you who come through Faith Builders, you've heard this from me before, I always use the watch analogy, which is simply that anyone can look at two sets of data with different worldviews, and you see that data in completely different ways. So say, for example, we understand the concept of time, but there's no such thing as wristwatches. You've never seen this before. And if I were digging in my flower bed yesterday and put my spade in and I found this thing buried down in the ground someplace, I dusted it off and I look at it, and ultimately there are two ultimate origins how it came to be that are possible. What are the two possible things? It could either
Always been there?
it could be a natural product of the earth, or somebody made it. Yeah, one of the two, right? Now, looking at it, it gives some clues as to which of those two might be most possible, right? You know, it shows obvious evidence of design. It seems like it's got, you could put it on your wrist. It's moving like every second, right? There would be obvious reasons to think that this was not a natural product of the earth, that there must be someone out there who makes these things, even if I've never met them, right? There must be a watchmaker, even though I've never heard of them, even though in fact, if I came in this morning and dusted this off and told you guys that I thought this was some fancy crystal that was growing next to my house, you'd wonder what I was smoking before I came in.
We would try to institutionalize you.
Correct. You just wouldn't believe me. There's no way, right? But now if you take this from the size of a watch to the size of a solar system, either there's a watchmaker or there isn't. I believe that there's a watchmaker. Now, if you want to start out by saying you don't believe it's possible that a watchmaker exists, let's come up with a way in which this could have happened. Now, what is that going to take? It's going to take probably some ore deposits, volcanic sort of activity that would maybe make that metal liquid, maybe pressure could make the heat instead. Maybe there'd be crystals around that would happen to fall in just the right way. There'd have to be tectonic plate movements to move these things to get it just right and polished. The odds of this happening are really, really low, right? It might take years, eons, billions of years for this to happen. And that's ultimately why the age of the earth in the scientific model is as long as it is, because of the time necessary to make those things that are statistically impossible have a chance to happen. Now, here's the thing, what I say is I don't understand exactly how God created the world. I don't get it, but I believe it. I believe that there is a watchmaker, and that then I take a look at the things of this world, and I see them as the work of a master craftsman, not the work of a cosmic accident. And it was Richard Dawkins, who doesn't believe in God, that talks about, he would talk about the adaptation of species has been so perfect that you would think that God exists, except he doesn't. Okay, right? Yeah, so it's looking at it so for like this to say, man, talk about an absolutely unbelievable series of cosmic events that resulted this. Now, he would say, Dawkins would deny the watch analogy immediately because it's not organic and it can't pass along genetic traits to future descendants. But I just wanted to use that one because it's an old one, and I think it helps us understand those two things. So as Christians, we don't have to try to claim exactly to know how God did what he did, except we do know this, is that the Bible says there's a watchmaker. And even if people haven't met him, when we take a look at the things of this world, we can marvel at his craft, right? Yeah, please.
Yeah, so when it comes to miracles, the main kind of issue that you have to breach is naturalism versus supernatural. So the skeptic only believes in the natural but not the supernatural. So the immediate way to bridge the gap is just to prove something supernatural exists, which then opens the door. The easiest way to do that is with mathematics, which they already believe exists. Because mathematics is discovered, not made. It has set rules that people discover independently in places all across the world. It doesn't physically exist, yet everyone knows that it exists. So it's not of the natural world. Also, it's infinite because it has infinite data.
Yeah.
So if you have infinite data, that means there must be something to contain it, because everything that exists must be contained.
So
therefore, you
here's
need an
Jesus'
infinite
plan,
mind
though.
to contain it.
Jesus' plan for the church, though, isn't to show the world, to try to prove God through mathematics, but it was to prove the supernatural.
Yes.
And the way he did that was by dying and coming back from the dead. And saying, touch me and see. Pass me some fish. I'll eat some. If Jesus rose from the dead, then everything he says is true. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, like St. Paul says, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, you're still in your sins, we should be pitied more than all people. But, he said, in that great pivot from despair to hope, Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who've fallen asleep. And that's why the church, when it went out to share the message of sins forgiven with the world, they went out not as witnesses of the crucifixion. There were lots of Jews that were crucified in the first century AD. Lots. Only one of them rose from the dead. They went out and called themselves witnesses of the resurrection. Yeah. So, the appeal of the theory of evolution today is it seems like it's a great explanation. I one time heard somebody describe it as the theory of evolution is the best possible explanation we could have for things being where they are if God didn't exist. I can live with that. And that's, I think, exactly what it is. You have to start by saying there's no watchmaker, right? And if no watchmaker existed, okay, I guess we could come up with a plan about how this got made. But we believe there's a watchmaker. So the appeal of the theory of evolution, besides that there seems to be an explanation that doesn't need God, is, of course, then you don't need God. What's the appeal of that? Well, then it puts humanity on the top of the pyramid. And it means you are accountable to no one except yourself. You're the master of your fate. You're the commander of your soul. I think I switched those two up. Invictus, right? You're it. And because, honestly, if there really were a God who could create the solar systems by saying, let there be light, you might need to listen to him. Right? You might need to listen to him. So, another thing we want to just talk about real quickly is a lot of times Christians want to find a way to combine watchmaker and not watchmaker, combine evolution and creation. And they do that by trying to take the days of creation in Genesis 1, there was evening and there was morning, the first day, there was evening and morning, the second day. And they want to say, hey, with God, God's timeless, so those days, maybe they just were eons instead. Maybe what if each day were 1 billion years, and then maybe you could use the creation to go ahead with it. And this is a place where you want to be very careful if you're reading Dr. Keller's book along with us. This would be a place that I would completely disagree with Dr. Keller. Dr. Keller sees Genesis 1 as a metaphorical song describing the real history that happened in Genesis 2. And he uses examples of it like in Exodus 14 and 15. That's where you see the account of the Exodus and the crossing of the Red Sea. And the next chapter is the Song of Moses, where he sings about God's deliverance of Israel. Same thing with Judges 4 and 5. where the salvation or the victory happens, and then Deborah sings about it. And so he's saying, well, Genesis 1, that's probably just singing about it. That's just metaphorical. Genesis 2 is history. There's quite a few Christians who would do that. But I think, take a look at this paragraph at the bottom. This is by Dr. Matt Harrison. He's the president of the Missouri Synod. He said, "You simply cannot stretch the days of Genesis 1 into eons, nor to somehow accommodate science or evolutionary theory, or even some version of old earth creationism based on a non-literal understanding of day." The word day in the Old Testament, it's the Hebrew word yom. Just so you know, like linguistically, I think it's used 2,212 times in the Old Testament. And all except one of them, they mean a 24-hour period sort of thing. So the prepondering, when you use this word in the Old Testament, especially when you say there was evening and there was morning, it means a day, like yesterday, today. Either the account in Genesis 1 and 2 is a myth, or it is history, albeit history written in a profoundly simple way to express profound truths. There's no middle ground. If humankind is a result of some evolutionary process, then death was built into creation from the beginning, a view that the scriptures categorically reject. In the end, there can be no historical Adam and Eve in a mythical Garden of Eden. So-called old earth creationism largely runs aground. I think he points it out really, really well, that what Dr. Keller is trying to do is allow there to be evolutionary process that results in Adam and Eve in the garden. And what you end up doing is you make a liar out of a lot of parts of the Bible. You say God and Moses didn't know that what they were doing when he gave the 10 Commandments and said, in 6 days you created the earth. That Jesus didn't know the truth when he said that in the beginning God made them male and female, and for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And also, if you take Genesis 1 as being a mythical song and use evolution to do what the Bible says God did, Harrison's point there, if you have to introduce death into the equation, because of course this is what it takes, right? Species have to live and die to survive, the fittest, to become what they are. And then it would make God, in the entire story of Scripture, that death came as a result of sin, not that death preceded it. You have to understand that if you want to try to make creation and evolution compatible, all you're doing is getting rid of the creation part. You're just keeping the evolution part.
Well, I've always been, not decided on old earth, new earth. But you and I had a conversation not long ago, and you asked me a question. You says, when God created Adam, how old was he?
Yeah.
And, he obviously didn't create him as a baby. So he must have created him with the appearance of being a 25 or 30-year-old man. So that, to me, really starts to go to the young earth. 7 days.
Yeah, I thank you, Bob, for reminding me. I was going to say that. I really think the best way for us to understand what happened here by coordinating both what the Bible says and what science says is not by giving up on faith in the Bible, but listening maybe a little more carefully. When God describes how he created this world, he created a world full of resources, ready for his people to live in, filled with a man and a woman in this perfect marriage. Adam, on day 7 of creation, was how many days old? How old did he look?
We don't know.
Perfect age, right? Probably 50, I guess. Just saying.
He looked at least 60.
Think about this. They're standing next to a tree in the garden. The tree's 4 days old. How old did it look? Mature. 20 years? 30 years? I don't know. They're standing over top of they're standing over top of the earth under which there's deposits of coal and oil. You know what coal comes from, right? Plants that have decayed and right stuff like that. If God really created that all on day 2, that coal was how many days old? How old did it look?
Eons.
100,000 years? Somebody tells me that the Rocky Mountains are rising at like 1/8 of an inch a year or something like that because of the tectonic plates, right? Adam and Eve were standing there in this world that God had made for them, surrounded by mountains. Those mountains were 6 days old. How old they look? I mean, they're 20,000 feet tall and they're rising at an eighth of an inch a year, or whatever it is, you can figure it out. God didn't create, this answers the old question about what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? The answer is the chicken. The chicken. God didn't create embryos, he created people. He didn't create seeds, he created trees. He didn't create a resourceless earth that would take hundreds of thousands or millions of years to be able to serve as a place for his newly created race of mankind to live. He created a world fully resourced. So this world, so if Adam was 1 day old but looked like he was 30 years old, God also created a world, a planet, a universe that had the appearance of age too. Someone says, they dig something up and carbon date it and say this is, 400,000 years old. I'll be like, okay. Just like if you cut down that tree in the Garden of Eden that was 5 days old, you know what you'd have seen on the stump? Rings. Rings representing years that never actually happened.
Well, we don't know. It could just be like one ring.
I don't think so, because I think this is the whole thing. Because, of course, trees don't work that way. And God created this world with an appearance of age, just like Adam didn't look like an embryo. He was a grown-up person. My guess would be if you'd, put one at Adam's head and carbon dated him, they'd come up with about 30 years or whatever it was. Robert?
This is often argued as why have the evolution and stuff like that. And yet I've been to an environmental lab where they have 4 rocks showing the effects of erosion control. And they have a rock that they have that this is 100 years worth of erosion control, this is 50 years worth of erosion control, this is 25 years worth, and this is 5 years. And I know they didn't build that experiment 100 years ago.
Right, yeah.
Because the person that built it told me what they had to do. They were like, that's not what you do, but it looks
like
absolutely the way it should look. And those same people will sometimes go, we can do it, but God couldn't.
Right, exactly. We can build things with an appearance of age, so could God. So here's my point that I think helps me with science. If you believe there's a watchmaker, if you believe there's a God who could create this third rock revolving around the sun with the word of his mouth, if he could say, let there be, and it happens. If he could say, let there be stars in the sky, and everything that the James Webb telescope is seeing, he made. If he could do that, he could put coal in the ground that looks 400,000 years old. He could create trees, not seeds, and people, not embryos. Doris?
One of the things that I thought about after reading the book to prepare for this, when did time originally start?
When did time originally start? When God said, let there be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we fast forward to today, our timing is the same as it was in the beginning. That was when light and dark were created, and we're still using that same calendar.
We are still using that same calendar. Yeah, God said that's why he blessed the seventh day and made it holy. That's why, exactly. Yeah, and so we'd still be worshiping on that seventh day, except we're now worshiping what the Christian church called the eighth day. The day that the Son of God rose from the dead and there was a brand new beginning. And that everything that had been true was going to be made true again in the eighth day that started when the Son of God came back from the dead. And that's kind of the point I was making on the last page, is that the whole arc of the scriptural story is one that reminds us that God created a world that was perfect. Mankind fell into sin, brought this destruction, decay, and death. But then God sent his Son to redeem the world through death and resurrection to a life that points ahead to a time when this world and this universe will be restored to the perfection with which he made it. When you finish the book of Revelation, you see the picture of the Garden of Eden restored. The Garden of Eden restored again, just as God had made it. Again, remember, our ultimate goal is not to be in heaven with God. We're going to leave heaven one day and live in the new earth, recreated by our Father back into what he'd made before. That's the point of every one of Jesus' miracles, is you can see him starting to peel back the effects of sin. to point people ahead to a day where sick people don't be sick anymore, lame people walk, blind people see, and dead people live. Right? Look at the quote on the last page. Biblical miracles lead not simply to cognitive belief, but to worship, to awe, and wonder. Jesus' miracles in particular were never magic tricks, designed only to impress and coerce. You never see him say something like, "See that tree over there? Watch me make it burst into flames." Instead, he used miraculous power to heal the sick, feed the hungry, and raise the dead. Why? Well, we modern people think of miracles as the suspension of the natural order, but Jesus meant them to be the restoration of the natural order. The Bible tells us that God did not originally make the world to have disease, hunger, and death in it. Jesus has come to redeem where it is wrong and heal the world where it is broken. His miracles are not just proofs that he has power, but also wonderful foretastes of what he's going to do with that power. Jesus' miracles are not just a challenge to our minds, but a promise to our hearts that the world we all want is coming. Next week, we're going to talk about the skeptic's question. You can't take the Bible literally, can you? Looking forward to having you there. Hey, Bob, if you follow me,